When you stop replying, stop being available, people don't react the way you expect. So what actually changes? You or them? Most people assume distance weakens you. They believe if you disappear, you lose relevance, you lose connection, you slowly fade from people's minds. But what actually happens is far less comfortable and far more revealing. What they see as loss is often where the shift actually begins. When you remove yourself, something subtle begins to shift, and most people miss it at first. You don't actually become invisible in the way they assume. You don't simply fade out or disappear from people's awareness. Instead, you become harder to read, harder to predict, and harder to place. Your absence doesn't erase you. It disrupts the pattern people had of you. And people don't ignore what they can't easily understand. They begin to fill in the gaps. They start to interpret your silence, question your distance, and quietly wonder what changed. And what they imagine in that silence is rarely neutral. At first, they try to explain it in simple ways. They assume you are busy, distracted, going through something temporary. But as your absence continues, those explanations stop working. The usual narrative they had about you begins to break down. And when that happens, something more revealing takes its place. They begin to project, not based on what you said, but based on what they fear, what they suspect, and what they never fully understood about you in the first place. Which means they start revealing more about themselves than about you. This is where the shift becomes uncomfortable for them. When you were present, you were easy to define. You responded, you reacted, you gave them something to measure. But now there is nothing to anchor their perception to. No signals, no reassurance, no confirmation. And without that, they are left with uncertainty. People are far less comfortable with uncertainty than they admit. So they start watching more closely, thinking more carefully, trying to read between things that are no longer there. Because uncertainty forces attention in a way presence never could. And the more they try to understand your silence, the more they become aware of how much they depended on your presence to feel certain. Your consistency used to stabilize their view of you, now that stability is gone. In its place, there is a quiet tension. They start revisiting past interactions, replaying things you said, looking for signs they missed, not because you gave them new information, but because you stopped giving them any at all. What unsettles them is not your absence itself, but the lack of control it creates. When you were accessible, they could reach you, test you, measure your reactions, and adjust their behavior around you. There was a sense of balance, even if it was subtle. But now that access is gone, they can't predict when or if you will respond. And without that access, they lose the ability to manage how they are perceived by you. That loss of control quietly disturbs them more than they admit. And once that control is gone, the dynamic is no longer equal. And without realizing it, the balance begins to shift in your favor, not because you are doing more, but because you are no longer reacting. When you were constantly present, your value was easier to measure, easier to take for granted. Now, your absence introduces a kind of weight. You become less predictable, less available, and therefore harder to position. And people instinctively assign more importance to what they cannot easily access or define. At this point, something quieter begins to happen beneath the surface. People start adjusting their behavior without you saying a word. They become more careful with how they approach you, more selective with what they say, even in your absence, not because you demanded it, but because uncertainty forces them to. When they can no longer rely on your immediate reaction, they start anticipating instead. They think ahead, they measure their words, and in doing so, they give you a level of consideration that constant availability never allowed you to have. You didn't ask for that shift, but they adjusted anyway. you start to notice something else as well, something that most people never see because they are too involved to step back. Patterns begin to surface with a clarity that was not available before. You see who reaches out without needing a reason, and who only appeared when it was convenient. You see who respects your distance, and who tries to break it out of their own discomfort. Without constant interaction clouding your view, people reveal themselves through their reactions to your absence, not your presence, and once you see these patterns, they become difficult to ignore. There is also a shift happening inside you, and it is less obvious but far more important. When you are no longer surrounded by constant input, opinions, expectations, and reactions, your thinking starts to slow down and sharpen at the same time. You begin to notice how much of your behavior was shaped by immediate responses from others. Without that pressure, your decisions become less reactive, more deliberate. You start choosing when to engage instead of feeling pulled into it. And that control, once you feel it, is difficult to give up again. If you are starting to notice this shift in yourself, where you feel less reactive, more deliberate, but you're not fully sure how to use it, that's where most people lose it again. There is a way to hold that position without overcorrecting, without explaining yourself, without slipping back into old patterns. I've broken that down in detail in something called the art of strategic indifference. It shows you how to stay in control of your attention, your presence, and how others perceive you without forcing it. If that's something you want to understand properly, the link is in the description. Over time, the noise you once accepted as normal begins to feel unnecessary. Conversations that once felt important start to seem repetitive, predictable, even hollow. You begin to recognize how much of social interaction is driven by habit rather than intention. And because you are no longer constantly participating in it, you can observe it without being influenced by it. That distance gives you a kind of clarity most people never reach, because they never step far enough back to see it. Most people never reach this distance, so they never see it clearly. And once you see it clearly, returning to how things were becomes difficult. You start to recognize when people are seeking validation rather than connection, when they are speaking to maintain a position rather than express something real. You notice how quickly respect fades when you are always available, and how it quietly rebuilds when you are not. These patterns were always there, but they were hidden behind constant interaction. Distance doesn't create them, it reveals them. This is where the advantage becomes more defined and more deliberate. When you understand how your presence and absence shape perception, you are no longer reacting to people. You are positioning yourself. You decide when to be seen, when to speak, and when to remain out of reach. And that choice carries weight, not because you force it, but because it is rare. Most people cannot maintain distance without feeling the need to explain it. When you can, it changes how you are perceived without you having to say anything at all, because the less you explain yourself, the more weight your presence carries. There is also a subtle shift in how people assign value to you over time. When you're constantly present, your attention feels ordinary, almost expected. But when you step back and become less available, that same attention becomes selective. It carries more meaning, simply because it is no longer given freely. People begin to notice when you engage, not because you changed what you say, but because you changed how often you say it. And frequency, more than content, often shapes how value is perceived. At a certain point, people stop trying to fully understand your absence. Instead, they begin to adapt to it. They accept that you are not always reachable, not always responsive, not always within reach. And in that acceptance, something shifts again. Your presence becomes intentional rather than expected. When you appear, it feels deliberate. When you speak, it feels considered. And that controlled presence creates a quiet authority that does not need to be announced. And by then, your absence no longer needs justification. What most people fail to realize is that nothing about this requires force or explanation. You are not asserting dominance, you are not making statements, you are not trying to be understood. You are simply removing unnecessary access. And that alone changes the structure of how people relate to you. Because when access is limited, attention becomes intentional. People begin to approach you with more thought, more caution, and more awareness of how they are perceived in return. Not because you demanded it, but because the dynamic quietly shifted in your absence. And once that shift settles in, it begins to shape how people behave around you in ways that are difficult to reverse. They become more aware of your reactions, even when you give very little away. They think twice before speaking carelessly, because they are no longer sure how you will interpret it. Even silence from you starts to carry meaning in their minds. What once felt neutral now feels intentional. And this changes the dynamic without you having to assert anything directly. It is not control in the obvious sense. It is influence created through restraint, and most people do not know how to respond to that. They adjust, even if they don't realize why. When you remove yourself from everyone, you begin to see that your value was never in how often you were present, but in how little you needed to be. And once you understand that, you stop trying to maintain connections out of habit or expectation. You engage when it serves a purpose, and you step back when it does not. That alone changes how you move, how you think, and how you are perceived. There's also a point where your absence stops being questioned and starts being respected. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. At first, people try to understand why you stepped back. They look for reasons, explanations, something that makes your behavior familiar again. But when those answers never come, they begin to accept that your distance is not temporary. It becomes part of how you operate. And once something feels consistent, people stop resisting it and start adjusting to it, even if they don't fully understand it. And in that adjustment, something even more subtle begins to take shape. People start to treat your time differently, even when you haven't said a word about it. They hesitate before reaching out without purpose. They think more carefully about what is worth your attention and what is not. What used to be casual becomes measured. What used to be impulsive becomes considered. Not because you enforced a boundary directly, but because your absence made them aware that access to you is no longer automatic. And when access is no longer guaranteed, behavior naturally becomes more intentional. At that point, the dynamic no longer depends on what you say or do in the moment. It has already been shaped by what you chose not to do. Your restraint begins to define you more than your actions ever did. And people start responding to that restraint as if it carries meaning, even when you remain completely still. This is where silence stops being empty and starts becoming a form of communication on its own. Not loud, not obvious, but precise. And once that happens, you are no longer just part of the environment. You are influencing it without effort. And once you reach that point, there's very little left to explain, either to others or even to yourself. The need to justify your distance, to soften it, or to make it easier for others to accept, starts to disappear. You begin to understand something that most people never question. That constant availability is not strength. It is often just fear in a more acceptable form. People stay reachable, responsive, always present. Not because it serves them, but because they are trying to avoid losing relevance, avoid being forgotten, avoid feeling unnecessary. But when you step back and nothing actually collapses, when the connections don't disappear, when people adjust instead of replacing you, that belief starts to weaken. You begin to see that the structure you thought was holding everything together was never as fragile as you assumed. And more importantly, you realize that your presence was never the true source of your value. It was simply a pattern, a habit that made others comfortable because it was predictable and easy to rely on. Once you see that clearly, your behavior changes without effort. You stop trying to maintain comfort for others at the expense of your own position. You stop overextending just to remain visible, and instead you begin to operate from a place where your presence is chosen, not required. And that shift quietly redefines how you are perceived. From there, your interactions begin to change in a way that is not immediately obvious, but becomes more noticeable over time. They become fewer, but far more precise. You no longer feel the need to speak just to fill space, to maintain a rhythm, or to keep a connection alive out of habit. That impulse starts to fade. Instead, you speak only when there is something worth saying, something that adds weight rather than noise. And when there isn't, you remain silent without feeling the need to compensate for it. That alone begins to shift how your words are received, even if nothing about your tone or content has changed. People start to listen more closely, not because you raised your voice or tried to command attention, but because your voice is no longer constant. It appears less often, and because of that, it carries more focus when it does. Over time, this restraint begins to build a different kind of presence around you, one that does not rely on visibility or constant engagement to exist. It becomes less about being seen and more about being felt when you choose to step forward. It relies on precision, on timing, on knowing exactly when to engage and when to remain just out of reach, where your presence holds more weight than your availability ever did. And that is where presence stops being routine and starts becoming deliberate. And eventually, you reach a point where being alone no longer feels like absence in the way it once did. It no longer feels like something is missing or lacking. Instead, it begins to feel structured, intentional, almost like a position you are holding rather than a condition you are stuck in. It starts to feel like control. You are no longer pulled into every shift in attention, every message that appears, every expectation that others quietly place on you without asking. There is no urgency to respond, no pressure to stay connected just to maintain a sense of relevance. You begin to notice that you are choosing your moments instead of being absorbed by them. You decide when to engage, how much to give, and more importantly, when to remain completely out of reach. And that second part matters more than most people realize. Because your leverage is not built on how often you show up, but on how comfortably you can step back without needing to explain it. It is not in how many people surround you, but in how little you rely on them to define your position, your value, or your sense of control. Once that becomes clear, your behavior starts to shift in ways that are difficult for others to fully understand. You move with less noise, less reaction, less visible effort. Your presence becomes quieter, but more deliberate. You are no longer easy to access, easy to read, or easy to place. And over time, that reduced accessibility does not weaken your position. It sharpens it, making every interaction feel more intentional than before. If this made something clearer for you, then you can probably already see why most people never apply it, because stepping back requires a level of control that most are not willing to maintain for long. Let me know in the comments if you have ever removed yourself even slightly and noticed a shift in how people started to treat you or respond to you, because once you notice that change, it becomes difficult to ignore. If you want to understand this at a deeper level and learn how to hold that position without slipping back into old patterns, the full breakdown is in The Art of Strategic Indifference, linked in the description. And if this way of observing people and controlling your presence resonates with you, Stay with it, because this is only one layer of how these dynamics actually work.